6 days ago, at roughly 9:15 in the morning, Beijing time, an Iranian delegation boarded a China Eastern flight out of Tehran. The destination was not announced. The meeting was not on any public calendar, and the conversation that delegation was flying to continue had, according to the reporting later pieced together by Asian and European officials, already been running in silence for 6 weeks. That is where this story begins. Not in Islamabad, not in Washington, not in one of Trump's overnight posts claiming victory. It begins with a quiet flight to Beijing, because the real story is not that a ceasefire appeared on the 8th of April. The real story is that China had already decided the war would end on terms Beijing could live with. And once China touched the money behind the Iranian state, the political outcome of the war began moving away from Washington. That is the one axis that matters. The real story is not who announced the ceasefire. The real story is who made Iran unable to keep refusing it. And if you follow the money instead of the microphones, the answer is not the United States, it is China for years. China has been the dominant buyer of Iranian crude, not an important buyer among several, the buyer that mattered more than all the rest combined. Tracking estimates have repeatedly put China's share at roughly 85 to 90% of Iran as sanctioned oil exports. The barrels move through the now familiar machinery of shadow trade, ship-to-ship transfers, relabeling, reflagging. Cargoes that start Iranian and arrive disguised as something else on paper, they stop being Iranian. In economic reality, they remain the central artery of Iranian state survival. Before the war, that flow was running at roughly 1.6 million barrels per Dalton Y. That number is not a market detail. That number pays salaries. That number helps fund the state. That number keeps subsidies alive. That number keeps the ordinary machinery of government from turning into an empty shell. And on the 12th of March, that number stopped. Not drifted lower, not narrowed, stopped. Chinese refiners and the private teapot buyers in Shandong that had spent years absorbing Iranian barrels were quietly told to pause new contracts and reject cargoes that could not demonstrate secure passage. Beijing did not announce a punishment campaign. It did not need one. It simply cut the line and let Tehran discover the absence of money. That was the message. No speech, no grand threat. Just missing invoices. Within roughly 72 hours, Iranian oil exports to China collapsed from around 1.6 million barrels a day to under 300,000. That is not routine wartime disruption. That is a state-level financial shock, and it landed at the exact moment war spending was exploding. Sanctions were already crushing the economy. Inflation was already savage, and the Iranian system was far closer to the fiscal cliff than its rhetoric suggested. That was the pressure that mattered. America had missiles. America had aircraft carriers. America had the language of unconditional surrender. But the thing that actually shook Tehran was not an American strike package. It was a Chinese purchasing freeze. That distinction changes the whole story. Iran had spent decades preparing to absorb American kinetic pressure. The Islamic Republic was built to survive sabotage, assassinations, cyber attacks, missile strikes, and coercive violence. It had organized its strategic culture around the assumption that the main external threat would arrive in the form of force. What it had not built itself to survive was the sudden withdrawal of its one indispensable economic backstop by the state it had treated as its strategic insurance policy against the West. That is why this moment mattered so much inside Tehran. It was not just financial pressure, it was psychological rupture. China was not supposed to act like a conditional partner at the exact moment Iran needed unconditional economic oxygen. And once Beijing had Tehran's attention, it did the thing that separates real leverage from theatrical pressure. It translated the pressure into terms. This is the part that matters most, according to later reporting. Wang Yi communicated a framework to Abbas Araki in late March. China was prepared to resume oil purchases. Chinese financial institutions could extend emergency support. Chinese state firms could accelerate reconstruction commitments after the war. But Tehran had to accept a path out of the conflict that China could live with. The conditions were revealing. Iran had to accept a ceasefire framework that did not require American withdrawal from the Gulf as a precondition. Iran had to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial traffic on a defined timeline. Iran had to stop attacks on Gulf oil infrastructure, and Iran had to permit a Chinese-backed track to operate alongside and in the decisive phase above the public Pakistani mediation effort. That was the hinge. China was not simply telling Iran to stop. China was telling Iran that if it stopped on terms Beijing judged survivable, Beijing would finance the cost of stopping. That is real leverage. Military pressure can inflict pain. Financial leverage can redesign a state's choices. That is what China did to Iran. The broad framework was accepted on the 27th of March, which means the ceasefire publicly announced on the 8th of April was not the birth of the deal. It was the public packaging of a structure that already existed. China authored the skeleton. Pakistan provided the stage. Washington, for a brief moment, tried to pretend military pressure had authored the result. That mismatch between authorship and public credit explains almost everything that came after it. When the American delegation arrived in Islamabad, it thought it was arriving to negotiate the settlement of a war it had dominated kinetically. What it discovered instead was that the politically decisive terms had already been shaped elsewhere, and those terms did not look anything like Trump's earlier promises. There was no unconditional surrender, there was no clean symbolic humiliation, there was no total political collapse of the Iranian side. Instead, the framework reflected Chinese priorities: phased reopening, resumed talks, de-escalation clauses, and confidence, building language that implied eventual reduction of the American military footprint in the region. That is not American victory language, that is survivable settlement language, and that is why the later talks in Islamabad began to decay so quickly. Washington thought it was coming to fill in the final details. In reality, it was discovering that the settlement logic had already been written according to a political grammar that was not American. When the U.S. side pushed back, the Iranians reportedly produced documentation of prior agreement, not with Washington, not with Pakistan, with the Chinese-backed structure in the background. That was the moment the political meaning of the war changed, not because the United States had lost the battlefield. It had not American military power remained overwhelming in the kinetic dimension. But kinetic dominance is not settlement control, and settlement control is not the same thing as leverage. That is the basic error Trump appears to have made throughout this phase of the war. He behaved as though controlling the violent phase meant he still owned the terms of the ending, China. Understood the more important truth in a war this exposed to oil, shipping, inflation, and global market panic. The actor that can finance the exit can outrank the actor that dominates the battlefield. That is why Trump's blockade order after the collapse of the Islamabad talks looked less like strategy and more like reflex. It was the move of a president who had discovered too late that the outcome of his own war was being shaped through financial and diplomatic channels he did not control. And just a few days into that blockade, the contradiction was already visible. Iranian exports did not disappear. They rerouted. Tankers carrying Iranian crude began moving toward Gwadar, the Pakistani port under long-term Chinese operational influence. Cargoes could then continue east through pathways that made direct American interdiction politically explosive. What Washington could theoretically stop, it could not practically stop without risking confrontation, not only with Iran, but with Pakistan and China together. That is why the blockade looked strong and felt weak. It was loud enough to announce, it was not decisive enough to sever the architecture China had already started rebuilding. Export volumes began climbing again from wartime lows, still below pre-war levels, yes, but rising. That rise carried the clearest message in the entire conflict. Beijing's pause had not been a break with Tehran. It had been discipline. China had shut off the money to push Iran into a framework, then reopened the relationship once Tehran moved inside it. That is what real leverage looks like. Then came the public signals. Wang Yi spoke about freedom of navigation in language that deliberately mirrored legal arguments Washington itself had used for years elsewhere. The People's Bank of China announced a yuan-based settlement mechanism with Iran. Xi and Putin discussed a Persian Gulf security framework centered on regional states rather than external powers. These were not separate diplomatic curiosities together. They meant something very clear. Beijing was no longer reacting defensively to an American-led war. It was moving into the settlement space and trying to define the order that would follow the fighting. That is the deeper humiliation for Washington. Not that America lacked force, not that it failed to punish, but that punishment was not the same thing as leverage China could offer Iran, something the United States could not. A path in which the Islamic Republic survived, retained its governing identity, avoided theatrical surrender, and moved into a regional framework where Chinese finance and diplomacy mattered more than American coercion from Tehran's perspective. That is not capitulation. That is survival. And survival is what regimes choose when ideology finally collides with arithmetic. This is why the real question now is not who gets credit for the ceasefire. The real question is who has leverage over the next phase of the war right now. That answer is not Washington. It is Beijing from here. The future splits into three broad paths. Trump can escalate further in an attempt to smash the Chinese authored framework before it hardens. That means more coercion, more visible action, more effort to prove Washington still writes the rules, but that path risks forcing China into more overt support and widening the confrontation far beyond what the blockade was meant to achieve. The second path is quieter, and more likely the Chinese framework absorbs the public failure of the Islamabad process. The blockade remains more theatrical than decisive. Iranian exports continue rebuilding through alternative routes, new talks emerge elsewhere, and the substance of the final arrangement ends up looking very close to the Chinese structure already in motion, even if others keep taking public bows. The third path is the one Washington least wants to describe: honestly, managed retreat. The blockade is eased or abandoned, the U.S. footprint contracts over time, the Chinese-backed framework becomes the operative post-war order. American military prestige survives, but American political primacy in the Gulf is quietly reduced. I do not know which path will win, but I do know what this war has already revealed. The real story was never just about ships, missiles, and public declarations. America dominated the opening kinetic phase. China shaped the settlement leverage, and in the endgame of a war like this, the actor that can finance the exit can matter more than the actor that launched the first strike. That is what losing control of your own war looks like. Not battlefield collapse, not retreat under fire, but the quiet discovery that the outcome you thought you were dictating is already being structured elsewhere by the rival power you have spent years telling your own public is the main threat. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender. There is now a deal taking shape. It is not unconditional. And if there is any surrender in this story, it is not Iran surrendering to America. It is Washington discovering that the region it thought it could still discipline is already learning how to settle around it. The tankers are moving through Gwadar. The Yuan channels are live. The Pakistani public stage is fading. The Chinese private track is still running. And somewhere in Beijing, Iranian officials are not debating whether there will be a post-war order. They are reviewing the terms of one that is already being built. That is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next phase. And the next phase looks much less like American control than Washington is prepared to admit.